We have engaged in drawing lines upon maps where no white man's feet have ever trod. We have been giving away mountains and rivers and lakes to each other, only hindered by the small impediment that we never knew exactly where the mountains and rivers and lakes were. Lord Salisbury, former British Foreign Secretary and Prime Minister. Hi everybody, I'm back with another video with regards to the scramble of Africa. The northernmost part of Africa is Tunisia, and between Tunisia and Berlin, Germany, is a distance of approximately 3,000 kilometers. For context, that's the same as going from Richards Bay to Cape Town and back to Richards Bay. Well, almost. But on Saturday morning, on the 15th of November 1884, at Wilhelmstrasse in Berlin, which was the official residence of Otto von Bismarck, who was the Chancellor of the newly created German Empire, various European countries convened a conference that would gut an entire continent and effectively put Africa's downward spiral that had began when Africans were kidnapped into slavery, into overdrive. Politely named the Berlin Conference, it is also known as the Scramble for Africa and the Rape of Africa. And the conference was attended by 14 countries, being Germany, France, Denmark, Belgium, Austria-Hungary, Great Britain, Italy, the Netherlands, Portugal, Spain, Russia, Sweden, Norway, Turkey, and the United States. I purposely grouped the last 4 countries together because it's amazing the number of times people argue that Russia, Sweden, Norway, and the US had absolutely no role in colonialism in Africa. And although Russia did indeed assist in decolonization efforts, it must always be clear that this was not some belief of the right of each man to self-govern. It was more likely based on the Russian need to gain the economic and ideological advantage over capitalism. And we should never forget that as Africans. As Dr. John Henrik Clarke stated, we have no friends. So France, Germany, Great Britain, and Portugal came out the biggest winners and got the most African land divided between them, with King Leopold of Belgium taking over part of the Congo Basin, an act that eventually resulted in the deaths of over half the country's population due to the sheer brutality of Leopold's rule. Great Britain desired a Cape to Cairo collection of colonies and almost succeeded through their control of Egypt, Sudan, which was the Anglo-Egyptian Sudan, Uganda, Kenya, which became British East Africa, and South Africa, and Zambia, Zimbabwe, Botswana, which was the Rhodesia, Nigeria, and Ghana, which was the Gold Coast. France took much of Western Africa, from Mauritania to Chad, which was French West Africa, and Gabon and the Republic of Congo, which was French Equatorial Africa. Belgium and King Leopold II controlled the Democratic Republic of Congo, which became known as Belgian Congo then. Portugal took Mozambique in the east and Angola in the west. Italy's holdings were Somalia, which was Italian Somaliland, and a portion of Ethiopia. Germany took Namibia, which was German Southwest Africa, and Tanzania, German East Africa. Spain claimed the smallest territory, Equatorial Guinea, which was known as Rio Muni. Over the next 20 years, the colonial powers signed hundreds of treaties, which involved drawing on maps the countries of colonies, protectorates, and free trade areas of a largely unexplored and mysterious continent. The creation of long and narrow states such as the Gambia and Togo meant that the development concentrated on the short sea coast remote from upcountry regions. Many African states, like Swaziland and Burkina Faso, are too small to make viable economic markets and are below the threshold of any possible industrialization. Others, like Nigeria and the Congo, are so large and diverse that effective governance becomes difficult. It also created the most landlocked states than those of the rest of the world put together. They all face chronic problems of access, varying according to local circumstance. Colonial capital cities located on coastal peripheries have become national capitals of independent states. This random drawing of borders also forced a shared identity on nations who had never shared identity or nationhood, while also separating nations with a shared identity. So ethnic nations such as the Achewa people were dispersed between 3 countries, Malawi, Mozambique, and Zambia. On the other hand, nations who had been hostile to one another and preferred to exist independently of contact with one another were suddenly forced into one shared identity, with disastrous consequences, as with the eventual Biafran Wars and the eventual Rwandan Civil War. As much as I would love to, because I sincerely think most people think colonialism was a walk in the park, I can't go deeper into the absolute carnage and chaos caused by the Europeans within Africa, because this video would be hours and hours and hours long. And maybe I will revisit it one day, but I have put my sources in the description box for anyone who'd like to go over them and check me anywhere I need to be checked. In essence, however, by 1914, the Europeans had drawn up hundreds of treaties, placed countless hostile military personnel, and basically played around with the lives and livelihoods of millions of people they didn't know. The borders were drawn by Europeans for Europeans in Europe, and for all intents and purposes ignored Africa and Africans completely, save for the Ethiopians when they defeated Italy in 1896 and continuously fought total colonization. In some cases, the borders and created nation-states existed as and when necessitated by the relevant colonizer and their internal needs. For example, Burkina Faso, which was then Upper Volta, existed in 1922 and was then dumped by the French in 1932 in order to lower the French costs. Then it was again used as an administrative division in 1937, then becoming a full colony again in 1947 after the war. At the time of the Berlin Conference, South Africa did not yet exist. South Africa existed in the sense that there was an Africa and it had a north, west, east and south. But the country or nation of South Africa, or Azania, as with every other African country, did not exist. Settled by the Khoi and San nations who were predominantly hunter-gatherers, these groups were sometimes absorbed into the groups of migrating Bantu people during the Bantu expansion, and some remained separate and independent. This was, of course, until Europeans came and did what they do best, by establishing a halfway station in the Cape, then forming the first multinational corporation in the form of the Dutch East India Company. The Dutch then formed the Dutch Cape Colony, fighting with the British over land that didn't belong to either of them, sprinkled, of course, with the par for the course racism, classism, slavery, and hyper-exploitation of resources and the people, to the point of becoming a British colony as the Union of South Africa on the 31st of May 1910, which union was achieved by unifying the Cape, Natal, the Transvaal, and Orange River colonies. 51 years later, the Union of South Africa became the Republic of South Africa after the 1960 referendum that had been organized by the National Party and voted on by 1.6 million South Africans, who were all white. So essentially, by agreement between two groups of Europeans, South Africa went from belonging to Europe to belonging to the Europeans who had displaced Africans over the course of 3 centuries. Now, as we know, we must never stop reiterating, the people have always freed themselves. And with every instance of colonization, the people fought back. And in most cases, they were fighting back with stones and 1900s era weapons, against, in some cases, virtual weapons of mass destruction. So within a relatively short time in history, decolonization movements gained their independence, with most countries decolonizing between the 50s and the 90s. Some countries chose to change their names, like the Gold Coast, which became Ghana, and Bechuanaland, which became Botswana, while others kept the colonizer names, like Nigeria and South Africa. Although the subject of redrawing borders had been brought up by African leaders when negotiating decolonization, this wasn't entertained too much by the Europeans, and later the European Americans who had decided to enter the African continent and stake their claim. And this was for the one reason and one reason only. Although Europe and America supported change and independence on the African continent, they still wanted to retain the resources and the wealth. So, actually, they didn't support change and independence. They supported making things go back to normal as quickly as possible. So what's the point of this entire surface level history lesson? Well, firstly, we need to know our history. It's our literal lives which are affected to this day. Every single problem South Africa has can be traced back to colonization. Every single problem Africa has can be traced back to colonization. A little while ago, I did a pacification of Black South African emancipation essay. And in it, there was the quote, "The first step in liquidating a people is to erase its memory, destroy its books, its culture, its history. Then have somebody write new books, manufacture a new culture, invent a new history. Before long, the nation will begin to forget what is and what it was. The world around it will forget even faster." Milan Kundera. In the quote, Milan Kundera speaks about memory and the loss thereof. And to understand how this links to the Berlin Conference, let me ask you, as a viewer, who the president of South Africa was who oversaw the promulgation of apartheid. Off the top of your head, no Googling or asking anyone, can you tell yourself who was the president of South Africa when the apartheid laws were enacted? No one. That's the answer. Because South Africa at that time had a Governor General and a Prime Minister. The Governor General was the representative of the sitting British monarch at the time, and the Prime Minister accounted to the Governor General. The office of State President was created in 1961 after South Africa became a republic, and was only a figurative position until 1984, when the prime ministerial position was finally abolished. But if I ask you who was the first black president, or who the democratic presidents of South Africa are, excluding Cyril Ramaphosa, it would be shocking if you couldn't name at least two. But South Africa is defined by apartheid. Every response to any social ill is still affected by it. As I said before, colonization is where Africa's problems begin. It is our overarching backdrop, the experience that has altered all our lives for generations as the natives of this land. Yet outside of F.W. de Klerk and perhaps 2 or 3 more Afrikaner leaders like Hendrik Verwoerd and the ones who have roads named after them, we are hard pressed to name any others. Quickly, off the top of your head, tell me who William Nicol was. I'm serious, tell me, because I have no clue. And that's the result of a concept called collective memory. In a nutshell, collective memory refers to how groups remember their past. These collective memories can be about facts or about interpretations. To understand a country's memories is to grasp something essential about their national identity and outlook. Of course, countries do not have memories. It is the people in the countries who retain the memories. But often there are common themes. Again, this is a very simplified explanation that excludes the studies of cultural and communicative memory. But the point is that people have a collective memory, and collective memory is a part of constructing history. Different cultures will have different collective memories. For example, some groups hate Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi. Many of us as Zulu people cannot particularly relate, despite everything we know, because reality is seldom black and white. Collective memory and cultural identity authors Jan Assmann and John Saplika, in their research into collective memory and cultural identity, write, the binding character of the knowledge preserved in cultural memory has two aspects. The formative one, in its educative, civilizing, and humanizing functions, and the normative one, in its function of providing rules of conduct. This basically means that cultural memory is linked by actions which form the basis of our behaviors, and then the rules that we observe in line with that behavior, which then forms the cultural identity. So Africa, and by extension South Africa, finds itself in a unique position. Our entire formation as a continent is Europe. The Berlin Conference was undertaken in Europe. In fact, the first time Africans in South Africa made a single decision about their own country was 84 years after that country was formed. Some of our grandparents never reached the age of 84, which means that if they had been born in 1910, none of them would have ever had a voice in the running of their own country. And the story is similar for many other African states, even those that had a shorter run of actual colonialism. The lines drawn to benefit European extraction remain those that were drawn by Europe. So how can they benefit Africa? Most of the cultural practices we have European culture as their backdrop. When the Xhosa and Sotho people hold their cultural celebrations, there is still an unspoken need to frame it in European terms for European understanding. Same with the Zulus, and same with many other African cultures. And the collective memory is mixed with that of European practice, function, and rules. We have a minimum of 13 different nations and cultures who make up South Africa, but they all have an element of European memory, whereas Europeans on African soil have never had to consider themselves relative to African memory, unless it's to absolve themselves of any culpability. Most never even learn an indigenous language, while I am here, a Zulu native, speaking English in order to get to as many African people as possible. The reason we know the post-apartheid presidents better, and not the apartheid government generals and prime minister, is precisely because, as with all other types of memory, collective memory can be remembered and it can be forgotten. Despite my criticism of post-apartheid South Africa, never get it twisted. I will never believe that apartheid was better. I don't criticize post-apartheid South Africa because I believe that we should go back to apartheid or that apartheid did us any favors. I criticize post-apartheid South Africa because it deserves criticism as people who fought for me. You don't criticize what you don't love. Apartheid was a system that is sold as having been managed by people. Post-democracy South Africa is sold as people who fought for their freedom, now having the chance to run their own country. And it's hard to blame a system because it's easy for the response to be, apartheid is over. Even though all research metrics are clear that apartheid never died. It was just privatized, to quote Sizwe Mpofu Welsh. The history books aren't mentioning the Berlin Conference, and if you don't know how you came about, how can you know anything else? So as Africans, we crucially need to ask ourselves the following. Who are we as Africans? Who are we as Africans with an African imagination, wanting to build an African sovereign state? And this isn't about some aspirational narratives that talk to queens and kings and Africans who are all magical and wore traditional wear, because that's all rhetoric. It's beautiful, but it can all be reduced to rhetoric at the end of the day. Africa doesn't have its own African identity because our collective memory has become intertwined and mixed with elements that were created to benefit and serve Europe. What can a country that was created to benefit a group of men sitting in Europe define as its identity? And what can a continent that was carved out to serve colonial interests then partner with those it served on an equal footing, without there being redress and return of stolen wealth? And because I know people demand solutions when they don't want to think for themselves or they want to disagree with you but can't find a reason, I'll lead with a solution. We need to eradicate African borders. I'd say eradicate all borders because they solely create hostilities and are often to benefit Western elites and their local proxies. The entire first part of this essay on the Berlin Conference tells you why. But to clarify, Africa is not going to work otherwise, because it was never created to work. A South Africa with 60 million people, dozens of tribes forced to share an identity created by a hostile invader bent on extraction, will not compete with the United Kingdom economically. The UK, firstly, has a historic parasitic relationship with South Africa. There is nothing the UK or any Western country, in all honesty, has done to show that that scenario has changed or that it will change. Sheikh Anta Diop makes a pretty good argument for how this can be done in his book Black Africa. But my aim here is not to say that's the framework it has to take. One of the biggest losses to Africa hasn't only been the land. It has been the people taken into bondage. But a close second is the African imagination and the loss thereof, as well as the ability to define ourselves and imagine what a world based on our centered identity would look like. We have been virtually rendered unable to imagine ourselves crafting entire societies, and many of those who can still find it hard to reconcile good and bad. Africans need to invest in Africa. We need to push our leaders to open up conversations on the redrawing of borders, and perhaps even reviewing our governance structures for an African worldview. And we need this to be an African-wide project. Africa belongs to Africans, but Africa currently does not belong to Africans. It hasn't, since the representatives of 14 countries sat in a room 3,000 kilometers away from the northernmost point of the continent, without once bothering themselves about Africans. So whose Africa are we fighting for exactly? And why? Thanks for watching. Bye.